Hello, my name is Andy Brazier. I'm a freelance risk and safety consultant trading as AB Risk Limited. I've put together this short presentation to show how I think risk assessment matrices should be used. The matrices are part of a risk assessment process, or they can be used as part of that process. Let's be clear that risk is a combination of consequence and probability. It always sounds easy when we write that down. The realities are a bit more complex. The purpose of assessing risks is to ensure we've got sufficient controls in place, prioritise if we need to do anything else, and at the end of the day we want to make sure our risks are LARP, as low as reasonably practicable. A matrix is a commonly used tool. It can provide some objectivity and it gives you some basis for discussion. If someone has a disagreement or wants to understand how you came up with a result, a matrix is a useful way of doing that. There are lots of different matrices out there. They're all fairly similar. Here's an example here. It's got a severity rating, a likelihood rating, and different regions on the matrix give you your low, medium or high risk. For the purpose of this demo, I've put some definitions to the severity and likelihood ratings. It is quite difficult to come up with something that works at a very high generic level as a simple demonstration. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend these as ones you should use in practice, but it's good as an example. So we've got the severity rating, and I'm basing this on personal safety. You can do similar for environmental impacts, financial, quality. So S1 will be the least of our concerns, let's say a first aid case. S2, a minor injury. S3, a major injury, maybe with some sort of long-term or even permanent disability. S4, single fatality or maybe multiple major injuries. S5 being multiple fatality. Clearly that's typically what we're most worried about. Likelihood rating, very unlikely, a rare event, an unlikely, possible. This is likely to happen being L4, very likely or even certain. So yes, this rating goes from the least likely to the most likely. And let's just be clear about the process, because the matrix doesn't do the risk assessment for you. It's just a tool we use as part of that process. So the first thing we should do is identify the hazards. Now, a hazard is anything that can cause harm, and I do think it's very important that we understand the definitions of these terms. So that's a hazard. We're then going to identify the scenarios where the hazard may cause harm. Who or what may be harmed, depending on what sort of instance you're looking at. What's the nature of that harm? And really this is where we're getting to the severity. The key point here is that there may be a number of different potential outcomes. Each one may have a different likelihood. So one of the key messages from this presentation is that when you're doing a risk assessment, whether you're using a matrix or not, don't expect or don't aim for just one answer out of it. You're going to evaluate the risks, and possibly the thing that's sometimes forgotten, we should do something with those results. So let's take an example. A car hits pedestrian. The hazard is the car moving at speed. That's what's going to do the harm. The scenario is hit by a car when crossing the road. Person harmed is the pedestrian. It is conceivable that the driver could be hurt, but that's not what we're looking at here. Nature of harm would be some sort of physical injury. The likelihood of harm, that's going to depend on the speed. So this is why we are not expecting a single result out of this assessment. The risk is what we're here to do, and the actions we're going to take will be determined by the risk. So continuing that on, we've got some data. Pedestrian hit by a car doing 30 miles an hour has a 50% chance of dying. So that's our severity rating of S4, single fatality. And likelihood, well, 50% I would say is a fairly likely outcome. But that doesn't cover everything. 50% are going to survive. 50% of the outcomes are non-fatal. So I would suggest the vast majority of the remainder are going to be major injuries. And again, I would say the likelihood then is very similar. Some people may be very lucky, get hit by a car doing 30 mile an hour and walking away with only a minor injuries. That's our lower severity rating outcome. I would say, given the data we've got, that's a pretty unlikely thing to result, but still worth considering. So here's our matrix. We've got the fatality here as our worst case here. We've said it's a high severity incident and it's likely. So that's S4 versus L4. Comes into the high risk. We had our major injury. So that has a lower severity rating, but we said it was the same likelihood. So, it's a 50-50 whether you die or whether you have a major injury. The major injuries comes out as a lower risk, although still significant. And we then had our very lucky outcome. Low severity, actually in this case low likelihood. So yeah, this is not a risk we're at all interested in this case. What we conclude from that is someone hit by a car travelling at 30 miles an hour, there is a high risk of them being killed. That's what our matrix says, and I think that most people would accept that. What are we going to do about it? Well, we know that at 20 miles an hour, the chance of dying is reduced to 10%. So if we put that into our matrix, the fatality of risk is reduced. So originally it was high here because of high severity and high likelihood. We've still got the same severity because we're looking at fatality. The likelihood has been reduced. So we may say that the likelihood is now down to possible instead of likely, and that's putting us in the medium risk. We look at the major injury. Well, actually, it's not really changed. We're still looking at the same severity. Again, that's a key message from this, is that the severities don't change in these assessments. The likelihoods may. In this case, it hasn't done, really. We're still saying it's pretty likely you're going to get a major injury. But the lesser injuries, I would suggest, are a higher proportion will come out as a lesser injury. Before we said it was a low because it was an unlikely outcome. Now it's a more likely, or certainly a possible outcome that we'll have a minor injury. So actually our risk ranking for the lesser outcomes has increased to medium. So we can see now that if we've reduced the speed of cars to 20 mile an hour, our priority for action has been reduced. They all come out as medium. So that means if you've got other areas in your operation where you've got high risks, that's probably where you need to be focusing your efforts now, rather than this can be a lower priority. Let's have a look at it. We've got to do something about this as we act on these results. So it appears that reducing the speed is the answer. So we could set lower speed limits. Now the point here, this is the injury occurs because of the speed the car is doing when the impact occurs. So, just because the speed limit is 30 miles an hour doesn't mean the car is doing 30 miles an hour when it hits a pedestrian. It may be doing faster because it's we've not got compliance. It may be going slower because the car has been able to take avoiding action. So yes, we could consider lowering the speed limit. It appears that if we lower the speed limit to 20 miles an hour, the risks are reduced fairly significantly. We could take the compliance issue out of there and force cars to drive more slowly, some sort of traffic calming that really makes it impossible to drive above 20 miles an hour. We could give drivers the chance to slow down before impact. So if they could see that someone has stepped out into the road and they can apply their brakes, they're going to reduce their speed. They might be doing 30 mile an hour fully compliant with the existing speed limit. They can reduce their speed to 20 mile an hour or less. So we can do that by giving better visibility and lighting, so they've got more chance of seeing the pedestrian. We could change the road surface so they're less likely to slip when they hit the brakes. So that's a way of reducing the speed. But at the end of the day, is it reasonably practicable that everyone drives around at 20 miles an hour or slower? In certain circumstances it is. In a lot of cases it's not going to be. So we need to think of different answers. We are likely to be in the situation where a pedestrian could be hit by a car doing 30 mile an hour. The risk of fatality is high. So what we need to be looking at is, can we separate pedestrians and vehicles? So I would certainly say take a motorway. We don't allow pedestrians on motorways. And we need to think about other interventions, actually making the cars stop to allow the pedestrian crossing. So there are things we can do in the real world, fairly limited things that we can do. When we're designing roads, we can look at the visibility and lighting. We can look at the surface that we're providing. Once we've got the road in place, life's a little bit more difficult. Key message: this is reduce the likelihood, not the severity. Slower impacts reduce the risk because the likelihood of dying has reduced. But dying is still a possible outcome. And the matrix shows how the risk has reduced because we reduce the likelihood. The key message: if the hazard exists, the potential consequences remain the same. The potential is still there. It always will be while the hazard exists. We could say driving very slowly eliminates this risk. So maybe if cars drove at below 10 miles an hour, the potential for fatality is disappears completely. I think the key point there is actually we're changing the hazard. It's no longer contact. It now becomes a contact with a car rather than hit by a car. And essentially that's outside the scope of our assessment. We've done an assessment on being hit by a car at speed. Now we're saying, well, may make contact with that car. We would need to do a different assessment. We'd have to go back and start again. And that's one of the key messages. People often think that changing the hazards, whether it's eliminating or reducing it, is a control. I would always argue that no, that's changed the task, or it's changed the scenario that we're thinking about. It's changed the event. And that's great. That's what we really want to do. But we need to do a new assessment. Okay, let's take another example. Repetitive manual handling, some sort of production line activity. Hazard manual handling. The scenario is musculoskeletal disorders. The person at harmed would be the person on the production line. The nature of harm, there could be the general aches and pains, and maybe some people will suffer from long-term effects. The likelihood of harm will depend on the task and possibly the individual. Again, that's really why we would do this sort of assessment, because we want to know what the risks are so that we know what actions to take. Take our matrix again. The long-term effects, let's look at those first. Well, we've said that that could fall into the major harm category, and we've said it's possible that some people will suffer from that sort of outcome. And we've got the general aches and pains. Well, that's a lesser outcome. That's a minor severity. But we could argue, depending on the nature of the activity, but everyone doing that task or performing that job could suffer from some aches and pains at some time. So actually the likelihood becomes very likely or even certain. So yeah, we've got two results here, two different levels of severity. Both come out as medium risk. Maybe that doesn't help us prioritise. But the thing here is, by including both on the matrix, we can see there are different concerns. We've got the general aches and pains that everyone may suffer from, and with the more severe concerns that a small number of people might be affected by. So interpreting these results, we've got most people, or the small number of people. This is the interesting point for the small number. It may be down to the physical attributes, so the size of the person, their strength, maybe pre-existing conditions if they've already got a bad back or some other sort of disorder. Our risk assessment shows that both of these need to be considered with equal priority, but it's entirely likely that different solutions will be required. But at the end of the day, the message is if the repetitive manual handling is required, the potential outcome remains the same, so the severity rating stays the same. But we have some opportunity to reduce the risk if we can reduce the likelihood of those activities occurring. Eliminating the manual handling would eliminate the risk, and that is always the ideal situation. But we come back to what I said earlier, that it then becomes a different task because it's no longer involving manual handling, and we need to do a different risk assessment. No issues with that, but because the nature of the task has changed dramatically, I wouldn't say that eliminating the manual handling is the control in that matter. It's just created a new task. But just to look on the matrix, we've got our long-term effects reducing from medium possibly to low, and our aches and pains reducing their likelihood, but they may still remain a concern. So in this case, we may be able to put controls in, and this would typically be not allowing certain people to do the activity. Some sort of health screening might be the answer there, and we'll actually reduce that to say, well, we're not going to allow anyone with a pre-existing condition or who doesn't fulfil certain criteria. So we've essentially taken their risk to low, but the general aches and pains that everyone may experience, although still reduced, there still is a risk that we need to be aware of. And again, the risks are reduced because of the likelihood, the severities, the potential is still there because the manual handling is still taking place. One of the concerns or questions that people often have is, how far do we go? Should we be taking the very worst case? And the problem with that is some of these are, there will be some that can be quite far-fetched, although they happen in practice. Paper cut leading to death. Well, it can happen if the cut goes septic, so someone needs to take an operation and then they die on the operating theatre. You start to think, well, should we say fatality, an S4 severity for every little cut? Well, that's not going to help us. In this case, the cut didn't kill the person, it was the operation, and fatality is a known medical risk. So I think we should cover that risk under the medical side and not from the original cut. It's difficult to be too clear-cut about it. We need to remain pragmatic. Our risk assessments need to remain valid and useful. Okay, so I'm now into the final wrap-up. One of the key messages I wanted to get over as well is that likelihood and probability are not the same thing. I've used likelihood because I think it probably works best for most scenarios and certainly for a demonstration purpose. The likelihood is the chance of an outcome for a given scenario. What it doesn't tell us is how likely that scenario is of happening in the first place. That's where probability comes in. But to use probability, we need to have some idea of the exposure to a risk. So to do that with the example I used, how often does someone cross a road and how often are they hit by a car travelling at 30 mile an hour? So if we're going to use a probability scale, we need to have that data available. Whereas I've taken likelihood, so the scenario being they've been hit by the car that was travelling 30 miles an hour, what's the likelihood of them dying or them having a major injury? On the other example, if we're going to use probability, how often does someone perform the manual handling tasks? Again, I've used the likelihood because I've taken someone's job involves that repetitive manual handling. That's the scenario I've taken, and I felt that was an appropriate scale for the likelihood probability requirement to do our risk assessment. And just to finish, what I see as the common mistakes people make with risk assessment as a whole and when using matrices. They're often just looking for a single result from the matrix, and I hope I've demonstrated that that's not what we're looking to do. It's not usually appropriate. It's not very useful. There's often the claim that controls will change the severity. Well, I don't believe that's the case. I think if the hazard remains, the potential outcome remains. But it can reduce the likelihood. So the risk is reduced to likelihood. And as I said before, if we change the hazard, we've changed the whole assessment, we've changed the task, we've changed the scenario, we've changed the events that occur. So we're into a new assessment. So I would say change of hazard is not the same as a control. One of the big mistakes people take is they take the worst case severity and the worst case likelihood to determine a risk. Now we need to match up likelihoods and severity. So typically the worst case severity will have a lower likelihood, and vice versa. The lesser severities will have a higher likelihood. Trying to use the same matrix for all hazards and scenarios, I don't think one size fits all, although a lot of companies try to do that. Bold claims that the matrix proves that risks are alarp. They don't. The matrix is just a tool in a wider process that may well demonstrate alarp. And arguably, worst case, is that we don't do anything with the results. We do an assessment, and it's kind of nothing happens as a result of it, which is a big shame. Okay, thank you for listening. Put this out here because I realise it's an area that people are struggling. If you do have any comments, I'd be very interested to hear them, and I would be more than willing to adapt this presentation if people have different views that they feel add to the debate. But apart from that, thank you for listening. Goodbye.